to the situation in northern Syria and video which shows ISIS family members attempting to escape the Al-hol camp for displaced people. It's a complicated strand in the chaos that's currently engulfing the region. US officials say there are around 11 to 12,000 ISIS fighters in prisons in Syria. 2,000 of them are foreigners, not from Syria or Iraq. Now that the Kurds who were guarding those prisoners are busy fighting off the Turkish offensive, it's raising fears that the terror group could metastasize. And if to underscore that point, ISIS claimed responsibility for a car bomb in Syria today that killed 4 people. The US seems to have grasped the potential problem. US President Donald Trump tweeting that the so-called Beatles members of the British ISIS cell had been moved to Iraq. But then Mr. Trump dismissed the overall threat. He says because they wouldn't want to go back to Europe.
Well, they're going to be escaping to Europe. That's where they want to go. They want to go back to their homes, but Europe didn't want them from us. We could have given it to them. They could have had trials. They could have done whatever they wanted. But as usual, it's not reciprocal. You know my favorite word, reciprocal. That's all I want. I don't want an edge. I just want reciprocal.
To debrief this topic, I spoke to Hassan Hassan. He's the director of the Non-State Active Program at the Center for Global Policy. He's also the co-author of ISIS Inside the Army of Terror. I began by asking him whether recent actions by the United States would lead to a resurgence of ISIS.
I think this is an opportunity, an opening for ISIS. This could have been the alternative to the Turkish invasion would have been doubling down on the efforts to keep the pressure on ISIS and weaken its ability to return. In fact, over the past few months, what we've seen is improvement with the help from the U.S. of local forces and their ability to detect and go after and remove sleeper cells by ISIS. What's this doing is remove that pressure from ISIS and create gaps for ISIS to emerge. So it will precipitate the return of ISIS, the ability of ISIS to launch an insurgency, an underground insurgency in those areas, but also even expands beyond that eastern part of Syria into the rest of Syria, as well as in Iraq.
How are different countries handling the return of ISIS fighters or ISIS supporters differently? And what do you think is the most effective way to deal with that? The
fundamental question that needs to be asked first and foremost is that everyone has to share burden of those fighters on the ground. And we've been warning about this for years. And now see what's happening. Turkey sweeps in. There's a danger of these foreign fighters disappearing in nature. We don't know if like a new forces coming into these areas, ISIS might be able to exploit this, this change of hands from one force to another to pay bribes and leave and so on and so forth. The other question is what to do with these forces. I think once different countries take in these foreign fighters and try to deal with them with their legal system, then it becomes a question of how to make sure that they don't go back and become a danger. But they are, as the situation currently stands, they are a danger. They are a big threat for not just Syria and Iraq, but the whole world.
How do you see ISIS's strategy changing? They're always looking for ways to optimize their success and adjust to the new circumstances. So what would you be most concerned about now, watching what's happening in Syria unfold?
Well, you see, ISIS is probably the organization that we know the most about because there are precedents. There's a long history of ISIS operating in Iraq. There was a long history of ISIS being defeated several times over since 2003, since the war in Iraq. So we know how they come back. They know that they're always constantly waiting for the space, for an opportunity, for a chance to emerge and establish themselves and sort themselves locally so they can wage this underground campaign against their enemies. And once these attacks, the local attacks, become steady and durable, what that happens is that the population start to think twice before they start cooperating with, say, the United States or local governments. And that, by extension, makes it easy for ISIS to expand and return to those areas.
Hassan, your home is Syria and you still have family there now. You wrote in an article that 5 years on, even though ISIS's grip has been dramatically weakened and they've mutated in their existence, that you feel concerned that perhaps Syria is now more susceptible to radicalization now, even though ISIS is weaker than it was before.
Absolutely, and I think this moment tests that theory, that thesis, because what we saw is that over the past, say, 2 years, the situation in Syria start to, different pieces start to fall into place, where you see countries like the United States and Turkey and Russia asserting themselves in different zones, and these zones become more and more, say, stable in their own different ways. And that stability looked fragile, but something happens, and then the whole situation unravels. And I do think Syria, especially under the surface, is a very fragile situation. There's a fragile, precarious situation where anything can go wrong any minute, and then you'll see forces, not just ISIS, but also the Al-Qaeda, other jihadi organizations, other foreign fighters backed by Iran, and so on and so forth, to exploit any change of the dynamics and to rise again. I do think Syria will continue for the foreseeable future to be this kind of lingering problem that the world has to deal with, and not forget just because there's a relative quiet and equilibrium taking place in Syria, as we've seen over the past 2 years. Once something happens, there is a domino effect that you'll start to see different problems emerging and testing that kind of a sense of calm.